Okay, tonight we're talking about the value of freedom. I want to start by explaining the subject, and then I want to make a remark about the way in which we're going to approach it, and then we'll dive straight into it. You hear the words, the value of freedom, it's natural to think, how much value does freedom have? How does the value of freedom compare to the value of other things? When will we give it up? And so forth and so on. That's not my subject tonight. The subject tonight is a very narrow, specific question, and that is, what kind of value does freedom have? In particular, we distinguish between intrinsic and extrinsic value, two different types of value. And the question will be, does freedom have only intrinsic value, or only extrinsic value, or both? That's going to be the question. Let me explain what those terms mean and give you a couple of illustrations so we'll understand what we're talking about tonight. Something has intrinsic value if it is valued for itself, not as a means to something else. So extrinsic value if it is valued as a way of getting something else other than itself. So, rectangular green pieces of paper, American $100 bills, have a lot of value, but for normal people it's extrinsic. You're going to use those pieces of paper to get other things you want. Someone who just piles up more and more of those pieces of paper and feels he's better off because he's got lots and lots of them has a problem. He has a problem, typically. Money has extrinsic value. Pleasure, at least sometimes for some people, has intrinsic value. You ask a person, why do you drive a bus to earn money? Why are you earning money to buy a house? Why do you want to buy a house? To live in it. Not for investment, but to live in it. Why do I live in the house? Because I'll enjoy living in the house. Why are you going to do what you enjoy? Are you for real? Why am I going to do what I enjoy? Because I enjoy it. See, that's enough. I don't have to go any further than that. Often, the fact that I enjoy it is the end of the chain. I'm doing what I enjoy because I enjoy it, no further reason. It doesn't have to be, but it can be. It can logically be the end of the chain. Not only is pleasure an end of the chain, sometimes fulfilling more obligations at the end of the chain. You see me handing $500 to someone. Why are you doing that? Because I borrowed $500. I'm paying the debt. Why are you paying the debt? Why am I paying the debt? Because I borrowed the money, you see. And when I borrow money, I pay the money back. It doesn't need any further explanation. It might have, but it doesn't need it. No pressure for it. The third possibility is people, I think most people, though not always consciously, have a kind of vision of what it would be for them to develop in an ideal way. What kind of person would really be good for me to be? And then you do things to try to push yourself in that direction. And when some of the things you do, if asked why you do them, you say, because that's my picture of the ideal way a human being should be. That's what's best. And then again, doesn't have to have any further explanation. So you have extrinsic and intrinsic value, and it is possible for the same thing to have both. One of the courses I took in college was a course in the symphony, and one of the things we had to study and take an exam was Mozart's Jupiter Symphony. So the week before the exam, I was listening to the symphony. First of all, I like Mozart, and I like the Jupiter Symphony, so I was enjoying it. Second of all, I was memorizing it for the exam. So I had the intrinsic pleasure of the enjoyment and the extrinsic pleasure of doing better on the exam. So, when you divide things in the world in terms of the kind of value that they have, there are three possibilities. You can have only extrinsic, or only intrinsic, or both. Now, my question is, what kind of value does freedom have? And my answer is going to be that it has only extrinsic value. It's only like money. It's only a means to do something else that's valuable. There's no intrinsic value of its own. I want to make a remark about how we're going to carry this out. in ethics, a lot of argumentation, some say all, is a matter of playing off your judgments one against the other and trying to organize your judgments into the most consistent, integrated whole possible. Someone says, you know what you ought to do? You ought to do whatever will make the world a better place. And among the things that you have, alternatives you have, do the thing that will do the most to make the world a better place. If happiness is of ultimate value, do something that promotes happiness and reduces unhappiness. If pleasure, which is a little different from happiness, whatever it is that you think that makes the world a good place, that's what you should do. And that's often intuitively very persuasive. Now, let's suppose you're in a situation where the thing that will make the thing better is pleasure. I suppose the situation is this. 10 people are on a South Sea island, totally isolated from the world. They're going to live there and die there, and no one's ever going to find out they were there. And 9 of them would get a substantial pleasure, each one of them, out of torturing the 10th. And there's no other way that they could get more pleasure. According to the rule that I just told you, they're obligated to torture the 10th guy. That doesn't sound like a right result. It doesn't sound like under those conditions you really have a moral obligation to torture the 10th guy. So now you have a conflict in your intuitions. Yes, somebody could say, I think you do have an obligation, I believe in utilitarianism, and I'm going to follow it out to the end. But then the question will be, why? What was in favor of the thought of improving the world? Wasn't it just that when I think about it, when I measure it, I think about what my alternatives are for action, that seems like the right action? Well, in this particular case of the South Sea Island, it seems like the dead wrong action. So if you're going to lean on the seeming right, you ought to take account of the seeming wrong. And you have to work to adjudicate, how these things are supposed to fit together in some consistent way. A person who disagrees with the intuition about the case, if he really disagrees, sincerely disagrees, there may be nothing that you can tell him. You simply say, okay, you see the world in a way different, and maybe my argument when I'm appealing to these cases won't appeal to you. I'm going to describe certain cases. I'm going to rely on your judgments as to what is right and wrong in those cases. I think I'm speaking for the vast majority of people. If you're different and you don't judge these cases or interpret them the way I do, there may be nothing in my argument that can help. That's the sort of argument that I'm going to be presenting. Okay, so now, the position I'm defending is that freedom has only intrinsic value. That would mean freedom, which doesn't purchase something else that's valuable, it isn't a means to something else that's valuable, has no value. Let me give you a few cases which will illustrate this. They don't prove it in general. It illustrates it. I want your mind to at least see the kind of case we're talking about. And then I will give you an argument that I think does give a general reason to think this is true. And then I'll tell you the Torah's position on this subject. Let's imagine a person who's in jail. And he has friends who are working desperately to get him out of jail. And finally, after years of effort, they're successful. They come into the jail, they open up the doors, come to his cell, put the key in the cell, they open up the cell door, they say, "You're free!" And he says, "You're too late, because I'm going to be dead in 20 minutes. But he's free. For the last 20 minutes, he's free. The door isn't locked anymore. Is he better off? Have you done something valuable to him? If you had $10 to spend, would you spend it on opening the door or spend it on something else, like helping someone who needs a meal? Opening the door for him when he can't go anywhere, can't do anything with it, seems to be just empty, worthless. Doesn't do anything for him. Give you another example. up until, I guess, Obama, there was for 40 or 50 years an American law that American citizens could not go to Cuba. I didn't have the freedom to travel to Cuba. The law forbade it. Okay, I could have snuck and gone through with human traffickers and so on and so on, but it would have been much harder, much more expensive, much more dangerous. I didn't have the same freedom to go to Cuba. But you see, I never wanted to go to Cuba. I couldn't care less about Cuba. Not, for my money, Cuba could drop off the face of the earth and nothing would be lost, right? So if someone would say, I'm going to benefit you, I'm going to make your life a better life, I'm campaigning against that law, I'm going to get you the freedom to go to Cuba, I'm not going to be impressed because I have no use for the freedom to go to Cuba. I don't believe my life will be any better off with the freedom to go to Cuba than it is without that freedom because I can't do anything with that freedom. So I think if you ponder examples like this, you can at least feel the tug that freedom is as freedom does. The value it is that freedom has as a means to get something else, but it's not. But it doesn't have any value of itself. Now, someone could say you cherry pick these examples, but if we thought hard enough, we find other examples. That's why I want to make a more general argument. To say something has intrinsic value means, among other things, that you imagine a scenario, situation, state of affairs, and X. If X is in the state of affairs, and the whole state of affairs has a certain value, you take X out, the state of affairs becomes worse. Or if it's out, you put it in, it becomes better. That's because it has its own value. It's just one extra good thing. By the way, of course, when you take X out or put it in, you mustn't change anything else. That's a little tricky, and you have to be careful with the examples that you use and make sure it doesn't change anything else. But you can make up cases like that, and I'm going to give you one. So that if in a situation where you put X in, take X out, and it makes no difference to the value of the total, that's a good reason to think that it has no intrinsic value. So, in order to explain this, I want to introduce you to my friend George. My friend George is a hobo. In case you're not familiar with what a Hobo is, a hobo is someone who lives at the city dump. The city dump, the waste area. And he eats, of course, it's an American city, so he eats two-day-old food, which is probably pretty good. And he wears clothes that was changed because of the fashions, so they're still warm, and they still fit. They're just a little out of date. And he manages. When he gets bored with the city dump, he jumps onto the back of a passing freight train, and he rides to the next city. He goes to the next dump. That's George's life. In particular, nobody knows George, and George doesn't know anyone. They ask George, "How you doing, George?" He says, "Okay." "Are you happy, George?" "Not particularly." "Are you unhappy?" "Not particularly. My life is sort of blah." That's my life. That's who I am. That's how I live. Is that a story? Fine. Enter the two new characters, the kidnappers. They've been observing George, and they say, he's an eccentric billionaire. He really has, unlimited funds, and he's part of a network with lots of money. We're going to kidnap him and hold him for ransom. So they go down to the city dump, and they put George in a body bag, and they take him off in a helicopter to the forest. In the forest, there's a hut, a 2-room hut, sitting room, sleeping room, and they lock him up in the hut. And they visit him every couple of days and bring him some 2-day-old food. And as the weeks go by, the months go by, they have some worn-out clothes that they bring to him, which when the seasons change and so on and so on. That's how George is living. The door is locked. Now let's interview George. How you doing, George? Okay. You happy? No, not particularly. Unhappy? Not particularly. Are you pining away for the dump? Are you praying for the day when the door opens and you go back to the dump? Not really. If they open the door, would you stay here? Probably not. I'd probably go back to the dump. But if you have to stay here 6 years, would it bother you? Not really. Just, the answers he gives you in the hut are identical to the answers that he gives you at the dump. George is locked up. George has very little freedom, no freedom of movement. Is he worse off? Is he worse off? Let me make it brutal. They're collecting money to ransom George. And they ask you, would you please contribute? I have $1 at the moment to give to charity. They're asking me for $1 to help free George. And as I'm pondering, a 6-year-old falls off his bike onto the sidewalk and skins his knee, and he's crying. With that $1, maybe this example's out of date, with that $1 you can buy an ice cream cone. Now it's $3? I don't know. That $1 buy an ice cream cone for this kid, and he won't cry anymore. So here are my choices. Spend $1 on George's freedom. Capital F, freedom. Or give $1 to pay for an ice cream cone for the kid who's fell and skinned his knee. Frankly, I think it's morally more appropriate to buy the ice cream cone. Because I don't think that freeing George makes the world a better place. Now, let me warn you, with a warning which I know you won't heed and you won't follow, but the overwhelming temptation in dealing with this example is to change the conditions. But maybe if you give him his freedom, he goes back to the dump, he'll meet somebody, and that person will change his life, and he'll have new opportunities and so forth and so on. If that's your impulse, recognize that by changing the condition of the example in that way, you're proving my point. Because what are you doing? You're making his freedom into a means to something else of value. What's my point? My point is that freedom has only extrinsic value. It's only valuable as a means to something else that's valuable. If you are tempted to change my example into one in which, by giving him freedom, he gets something else of value, you're confirming my position. My position is that freedom has extrinsic value, and you're creating an extrinsic value that it has. Congratulations, you're on my team. You're not objecting to my argument. My argument is designed to create a case where there aren't any extrinsic connections. Freedom doesn't do anything. It has no effects of interest. It doesn't produce anything valuable. That's because I want to test whether it has intrinsic value. If it had intrinsic value, it would have value without producing anything, without being a means to anything, without purchasing anything. It would have value unto itself. So if you're tempted to say, well, his freedom is valuable because with it something good will happen to him, realize you're not objecting to my argument, you're confirming my argument. Again, the point of my argument is to create a situation where the freedom has no other connections. Someone who thinks that freedom has intrinsic value has got to tell me that George is better off with the unlocked door than he is with the locked door. Just because it's unlocked. Not because unlocking it gets him something else. And it seems to me, this is my intuition, that in a situation like this, the point of the example is to create a situation where the freedom doesn't purchase anything. When the freedom doesn't purchase anything, it's just a matter of being free or not being free. That seems to make absolutely no difference in evaluating the significance of the situation which he's in. Yeah.
So in the case you gave, once the door is unlocked, did you say that George would choose to decide to leave? Because wouldn't that make an impact? If he chooses to decide to leave, wouldn't that show that he does value to a certain extent his, hobo, city to city lifestyle, just because he's moving city to city, that he is entrapped in some room?
Maybe. When I usually tell the story, I don't put that in. I don't know why I put it in now. Let's leave that out. I agree with you. Let's leave it out. If he opens the door and you ask him, what will you do? He says, I don't know.
He's too lazy to...
I don't know. Maybe I will, maybe I won't. I don't know.
Okay.
So they're not pining away for it. They're not planning on it now. I accept the remark. Yeah.
What about the emotional factor? Like, say, talking about the freedom from Egypt, any slavery. Like, once you're free from shackles of slavery, you feel like, wow, like, thank God. You have a burden lifted off of it.
Okay, so this, see, in a subtle way, you are doing exactly what I described. He's asking, what about the fact that a person who's free feels happier, feels more creative, feels more important and more valuable, and so forth and so on, right? Okay, then that means the freedom is a means to a feeling. That's like money. Freedom gives you the feeling. It's not being free, it's the freedom gives you the feeling, and the feeling is valuable. And if you could have had that feeling locked up in the hut by giving an injection, you'd have been just as well off. Because what you really want is the feeling, not the freedom. So feeling, that's why I stressed, that's why I said George's answers to the questions you ask him in the hut and in the dump will be exactly the same. The way what you're describing, he wouldn't answer the same way. He'd say, if I'm free, when I wake up in the morning, my life is full of sunlight, and when I wake up in the hut, I'm dead all the time. That would have been a difference in the answer, but I didn't give him that description because I didn't want that external effect to change the case, because I'm trying to show that freedom has no intrinsic value. Not that it has no value, right? Yeah.
Wouldn't that show that the only intrinsic things are feelings? Because I could say anything, I'm only deriving benefit from anything because of the feeling that it gives me.
That's why I gave 3 examples of intrinsic values, 2 of which are not like that.
What would be the 2?
The 3 examples were, number 1 was pleasure, the second one was fulfilling a moral obligation, and the third was living up to a certain ideal that I think is an important ideal.
When the other 2, doing something that's a moral obligation, you enjoy that because it gives you a sense of like happiness or pleasure that you're doing something good.
That's right.
And then the other one, for living up to who you want to be, you get a sense of fulfillment or pleasure or happiness for living up to the person you want to be.
It's true that the numbers 2 and 3 will give you good feelings, but, and this is something we should discuss on another occasion in more detail, but they aren't themselves good feelings. They give you good feelings, and the good feelings are a result of your having achieved the things that you achieved, and therefore there's no reason whatsoever to say that the good feelings are what you're doing it for. They're a byproduct of what you do, not the goal of what you do. The fact that when you do something, you get good feelings, doesn't prove that the good feelings are the purpose for which you do it. They can be a byproduct of having done it. It's a very important point. Aristotle understood this point. Most people who are happy are people who are not seeking happiness. They're seeking other things, and they're successful in getting the other things. That makes them happy. They're not doing those other things for the sake of happiness. They're doing them because they think they're important.
Can we say the same thing for seeking freedom? There's a sense of once I'm able to seek freedom and actually be free, the byproduct of that is that happiness. So therefore, it would be intrinsic in the same way that the other examples you made were intrinsic.
Oh, but I mean, you could say what you like, you can talk as you please, but that wasn't his point. His point was, look, it matters because he'll have those feelings. That it's the feelings that makes it matter. That's what he was arguing. Mm-hmm. Not that it matters and it matters for itself, and then the feelings come as a byproduct. He was saying it mattered because of those feelings, and the proof of it is that if the feelings weren't there, it wouldn't matter.
And you're saying we can't come up with similar examples of just getting those feelings when it comes to, let's say, building character or doing a moral obligation. You mentioned the example of injecting someone with something to give them those feelings.
That's right.
You can't say the same example for those 2 other scenarios?
I don't think so. I think the person who, doesn't have those feelings, let's imagine a person who says, nothing I do is enough. Nothing I do will ever be satisfied what needs to be done. I'm never a success. But of course, I do what I can do, because it has to be done. But do I have feelings of happiness and fulfillment and satisfaction when I do these things? No, I continuously feel inadequate and so forth and so on. He would still do it because if you borrow money, you pay it back. And that's what you do, right? The same thing is true as living up to an ideal, right? You imagine a person who isn't living up to it, but he's living in that direction, moving in that direction. And he's constantly preoccupied with the fact of the gap between him and the ideal, right? So he may not feel good about it. He just hasn't been trained that the pursuit is part of the goal, right? Those clever mottos that people use to encourage themselves, But he's doing it because it needs to be done. That's definitely a genuine part of human psychology. So it's not that the pleasures are motivating him. Yeah.
So, since we could say it's a necessary condition for all the other things that happen, that wouldn't give any sense of intrinsic values. It's a necessary condition.
Adarabba, say something a necessary condition usually means that it's not intrinsically valuable. Money is a necessary condition for being able to go to the opera. Does that give money intrinsic value? On the contrary, it's a very important extrinsic value. It gets you to the opera. Necessary for makes it sound like I'm doing A for B, and I can't get to B without A. A's necessary for B, but where are my eyes set on? My eyes are set on B, not on A. And if I could get there, somebody makes it possible to get there without A, I'd skip A right away, because I want to get to B. Saying something's a necessary condition doesn't give it intrinsic value. Well, almost always that would be a description of extrinsic value. Now, some people resist this argument because they confuse intrinsic value with really valuable. This really counts. This really matters. This is important. And extrinsic with, it's really trivial, it's not important, it's only a matter of subjective and so forth and so on. That's a big mistake. Tell me something. Oxygen. Oxygen to breathe. Breathing air. Intrinsic or extrinsic?
Intrinsic.
What? You live to breathe? Breathing is a goal of your life? If someone gave you a capsule in your arm that suffused your body with oxygen, you'd miss breathing? I doubt it very much. I suppose you breathe to live.
But it's awesome to breathe.
Oh, it's awesome. Okay, sorry, I talked to the wrong person. The wrong person. Yeah. Okay, I hear. Maybe for you, breathing has something, right? But you can imagine what we're talking about, right? You breathe to live. You don't live to breathe. But breathing is one of my examples. Oxygen to breathe is very important, isn't it? Without it, you die. That's kind of important. It's a very, very important extrinsic value. And if you agree with me that pleasure can be a kind of intrinsic value, an ice cream cone has pleasure, but it's a really trivial intrinsic value. So don't confuse intrinsic with real, important, significant, and valuable, and extrinsic with trivial, subjective, and childish and insignificant. No, that's not correct. You can have very valuable items with very great intrinsic and extrinsic value, and you have items with very trivial intrinsic and extrinsic value. That's not the difference. The difference is that when you go after an intrinsic value, your behavior is self-justifying. Why are you going after X? Because X is valuable. Why is X valuable? Don't ask stupid questions. Paying my debts is valuable. Why that's valuable? Have a tea. I want to be, I've heard people speak like this. I met someone. I'm floored. I didn't realize a human being could be like that. I didn't realize that was within the possibility, the repertoire of a human being. This person is superb. His motivations, his understanding, his goals, his integration, his consistency, his sensitivity. I never dreamt a person could be like that. And I want to be like that. Why? Because it's awesome. It's just if you'll see it, if you'll meet someone like that, you'll feel that way also. It's a different way to be. It's a much greater way to be. Now, when I act in that, to be like that, so that's something which I'm not doing for the sake of something else. I may get pleasure out of succeeding, but that's a byproduct. I'm not doing it for the pleasure. Because I'm doing it, because I want it, because I succeed. That's what gives me the pleasure. If I didn't want that, I wouldn't have any pleasure. So the pleasure is there intrinsically. So this is the idea of an intrinsic value, and I don't think that that being free has that kind of value. Now, if I'm right, there's some important consequences. Not every freedom is of equal value. In particular, let me take an extreme example. Take two people, both of whom are unjustly locked up in jail. One guy is a neurosurgeon. He himself has developed certain techniques of neurosurgery. He can cure certain injury conditions or neurological conditions that no one else can cure. And he's, as a surgeon, very busy, and people are standing in line waiting for his help. And the other guy is a driftwood specialist. He wanders the beaches and he picks up interesting pieces of driftwood and he sells them in a store. And the king has given me the authority to free one prisoner. Shall I flip a coin? Gee, I don't think so. Because if I free the neurosurgeon, lots of people are going to be very significantly helped by him. If I free the driftwood specialist, a few people will have some trivial pleasure by buying his pieces of driftwood, that's all. The world will be a better place if I free the driftwood, the surgeon, that I free the driftwood person. This is an illustration of the idea that freedom has extrinsic value. This doesn't prove it doesn't have any intrinsic value. But it does say, if you're looking at extrinsic value of freedom, there's a gigantic difference between the freedoms that people have in terms of their value. The brutal way to realize this is some people should be locked up because what they do with their freedom is awful. So there you see right away that freedom as a power to produce results, the value of the freedom is measured, at least largely, by the results that it produces. You may think that it has intrinsic value as well, it could be double. Okay, but my point is, when you focus on the extrinsic, when you focus on that, which I'm trying to show you is the only value it really has, when you focus on the extrinsic, then you don't judge all people's freedom equally. And if you have limited resources and you believe in increasing freedom, you shouldn't do it blind. You should ask yourself, what freedom will produce the most value? Yeah.
Would you say the same in the reverse case? So if you had two people in front of you and had to lock one of them up? Would you say the same
Of course, if I had to lock one up, I would ask who's going to do the most damage.
And would life then have intrinsic value?
I'm sorry?
Would life then have intrinsic or extrinsic value?
Would life have intrinsic value? I doubt it.
Then if
Life-
you had the choice, you'd
Being
shoot
alive? What? Being alive gives you the power to do things.
So if you had the choice, you'd have to shoot one of them, and you'd shoot the...
Well, that raises a different question with the shoot one. I mean, we don't make all of our decisions on the basis of value. There are other considerations than value which play a role in the decisions that we make. Give you a brutal example. I have one guy who has 5 healthy organs, and I have 5 guys who are dying because of diseases in each of those organs, one apiece, and he's the only match. So how about killing this guy to save the other 5? In terms of value for the world, it's losing one life and saving 5 lives. You could argue the world's a better place, but we don't do that. We don't kill people to save other people, even more other people. We don't do that. So that means there are rules for correct behavior which are not determined solely on the basis of value. It's one of the many cases in which utilitarianism is dead wrong. Dead wrong. Just like the case of the South Sea Island that I told you at the beginning, where the world will be a better place if the 9 guys torture the 10th guy, but it's wrong to do that. So, but when you're talking about something that has only extrinsic value, and you're talking about acting for the sake of value, then you have to talk about what the consequences will be. There's, for example, to borrow a point from Peter Singer, for whom I have a lot of contempt, but to borrow a point from him, let's suppose 2 people are, let's say they're incapacitated, they can't move around, they're stopped from, they have no freedom of movement, but one because he's been unjustly imprisoned by the government, and the other because he has a disease. You might argue that if you have the ability to free one of them and everything else is equal, you should free the one who's unjustly imprisoned because you're rectifying a moral wrong in addition to giving him his freedom. Whereas in the case of the diseased person, you're not rectifying any moral wrong. So morally speaking, you're doing a superior act by rectifying that moral wrong and giving him his freedom. I think you could argue that way. He applies it in horrific circumstances. Peter Singer, he says, if you have a house and the house is on fire and your child and your dog are both in the house and you can save one, you're morally bound to save the dog because you unjustly imprisoned the dog. You have no right to imprison animals. To rectify that moral wrong, and therefore you should let the child die and rescue the dog. And that's nuts. That's nuts. And it's nuts for the reason I said at the beginning. What are you relying on? Justice? Okay. I'm relying on the intrinsic superiority of human life. You don't like that? Try to argue against it. He tries, but with terrible lack of success. So I just want to point out that I don't subscribe to, but I'm taking that part of the argument, so I'm using it. So that's one thing. When you want to talk about freedom, now, what's the Jewish position on this subject? Well, there's a very interesting verse. We say the Shema twice a day. Some say 3 or 4 or 5 times a day. And it has 3 paragraphs. The 3rd paragraph is supposed to perform the mitzvah of remembering the exodus from Egypt. Well, it's a paragraph from the book of Numbers about tzitzis, strings on your garments. It's not obvious why that paragraph was chosen to commemorate the exodus from Egypt. Now, that's true. The last verse of the paragraph is, I am Hashem your God, took you out of the land of Egypt. Yes, it does say that. But you know, if you're trying to commemorate the Exodus, why not take a paragraph in the book of Exodus? See, Exodus, you know, like it's the same subject, the same book. You know, wouldn't that be, I think, what are you doing over there? Okay, there are explanations. But here's one important point that it characterizes it, and that is this. The last verse of the Parsha of Tzitzis doesn't only say that God took us out, it says why he took us out. I am Hashem, God who took you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. That's why I took you out. I took you out as an investment in the future. I didn't take you out to free you from slavery, because slavery is unjust, immoral, criminal, obscene, vicious. No, I took you out as an investment in your future. When Moses objects to God about the project of freeing the Jews from Egypt, one of the things he says to God is, what have they done to deserve being freed? And God's answer by implication is nothing. When they leave, they're going to serve me on this mountain. They're going to receive the Torah over here. That's why I'm taking them out. Taking them out to invest in their future. I'm freeing them so that they'll be able to do something of crucial value. That's why I'm saving them. And that's, I think, the essence of the Jewish value of the idea of freedom. That freedom is a means to do things that are valuable. And this has many important implications because there's a whole industry, of which I'm sure you're aware, painting Hanukkah and Pesach as the ancient Jewish anticipation of universal human rights and freedom. Well, no, it isn't. First of all, God miraculously saved only one group of people at one time from slavery, and that was us in Egypt. There are ancient societies, and there are modern societies today which have slaves, black slaves, which nobody talks about, especially progressives, because they're Muslim countries. In North Africa, where they have black slaves, millions of black slaves. God didn't free any of them. If God really, the creator of the universe, the ruler of the universe, is very interested in human freedom because slavery is a terrible crime, his application for producing freedom is very selective. And not only is it selective as applying only to us, it's only a minority of our history also. Majority of our history, we didn't have any independence, had no state, no government, no geographical concentration, and we were often brutally enslaved by the peoples around us. Even God's commitment to our freedom is limited. The source of the limitation is that God's action on behalf of freedom is an investment in something that is valuable to be done. And when it doesn't work out that way, then the freedom loses its value. You think of the Maccabees. Revolution in the name of freedom. Oh, really? And if in the population there are people who want to worship idols, are the Maccabees going to support that? No, they're not. Sorry. Because that's false worship. We don't believe in freedom for idol worship, or for satanic rites, or for all sorts of other things. So it's not freedom that we're fighting for. They're fighting for the ability to serve God in the way that God wants to be served. Same thing's true with Pesach. Masada. People, when they come on trips to Israel, they go to Masada. Masada is the place of a mass suicide. Almost 1,000 people committed suicide because the Romans were on the verge of conquering Masada. And what? Well, if you trust Josephus, and I must say, I'm not a historian, but from what I've read, Josephus has turned out to be spectacularly trustworthy. If you trust him, there was an ideology there, better dead than red, better dead than Roman, better dead than a Roman slave. Without freedom, you can't be living a godly life. Well, that's just wrong. It's wrong. After all, when the Babylonians conquered Israel and destroyed the temple and took the population off as a captive population of Babylon, as far as I know, in our sources, no one committed suicide, not one. Somehow, freedom isn't the precondition of living a godly life, even the life that God wants you to live. It's just simply not true. An Eved Knani, a non-Jewish slave of a Jew, is called a Ben Bris. He's a member of the covenant with God. A non-Jew who's a slave to a Jew has to keep almost all of the commandments. He keeps Shabbos. It's Kiddush Friday night. The fact that he's not free doesn't deprive his life of value. His life has more value than that of a free non-Jew. So, if you tell me that they would be mistreated by the Romans and tortured in certain ways, that's a different proposition. But as I remember, Josephus doesn't talk about that. He just talks about the final oration, which the leader gave, that, it's freedom or death. So, far from being proud of what they did, using it as an example, we would look at it as a failure, a gigantic failure of thought, and because of thought, action. Yeah.
Do we not say that Eved Ivri is punished for wanting to stand to his master and not wanting to be free?
I'm sorry, I didn't get that. What?
Eved Ivri, he's punished.
Who?
Eved Ivri.
Eved Ivri?
Yeah, he's punished for wanting to stand.
Oh, yes, that's right. A Jewish slave comes to the end of the time of his servitude. If he volunteers to stay longer, which he can do, he's punished and disgraced for that. He can do it, but he's punished and disgraced for it. God created you and offered you, commanded you to have a life of serving God. And you're serving a person in a way that stands between you and God. it's a degradation of the of a chief value of Jewish life, 100%.
Why wouldn't you apply the same thing with the people in Masada?
No, because there they said if you're not free, you should die. That's like saying that if a person becomes a non-Jewish slave, you should commit suicide. One of the reasons a person becomes a Jewish slave. One of the reasons a person becomes a Jewish slave is because he stole money and he can't pay it back. So the court sells him. According to that philosophy, you ought to commit suicide because he's not free. We don't say that, not at all. We have rules for him to abide by. Yes, the life of a Jewish slave to a Jewish master is not the life of a Roman slave. That I say is something else. If you're talking about torture and the results of torture, that's a different argument. That has nothing to do with freedom. It has to do with brutalization and victimization in another way. But I remember it, the speech there had nothing to do with that. If I'm wrong, then my judgment is wrong. Yeah.
Would non-Jewish slaves not also be able to serve God? And wouldn't slavery prevent them from doing that as well?
A non-Jewish slave can serve God. Rabbi, I'm telling you, you mean for a non-Jew to a non-Jew?
Yeah, or a non-Jew to a Jew. Either way, when
A non-Jewish slave, a Jew as a non-Jewish slave, that slave is obligated
I
in.
meant a non-Jewish slave. Sorry, to a
Again, I'm talking about a non-Jewish slave to a Jew,
Yeah.
a Canaanite slave to a Jew. He has to keep mitzvos. He has to keep Shabbos. You can't work him on Shabbos. He has to keep Shabbos. He has to keep kashrus.
A non-Jew?
Yes. A non-Jew who is a slave to a Jew has to keep almost all the commandments. And that puts tremendous limitations on what you can get him to do. So to say that his life is meaningless or worthless, absolutely not. His life is much better than that of a free non-Jew. Hagar, Sarah's servant, was an Egyptian princess. When Abraham spent time in Egypt, she saw what was going on. She said, better a servant in Abraham's household than being an Egyptian princess. Look what she bought for herself. We're living 3,800 years later, and we're discussing her by name, what she did, what she thought, what happened to her. You don't happen to know the name of any other Egyptian princesses, do you? Ancient Egyptian princesses? No? How many people care about their names? 0.00001% of the human population, right? Whereas those who are have their cultures formed by the Jewish scriptures are billions of people. She created for herself immortality and fame. And she was a great person. So it's not a joke when you say that she had a much better life as a servant in Abraham's household than she did the other way. Okay, so I just want to make one last comment. I structured this year, maybe it's obvious to you, by putting the Jewish position for the end. I think if I had started by saying the Jewish position on freedom is that it has only extrinsic value, no intrinsic value, at that point, the mind would click off, the eyes would close. This is crazy. Sorry, it's crazy, and forget it. There's nothing here of value because they're saying things that are crazy. If you go through the philosophical argumentation and you see that there's a lot to be said in favor of it in general philosophical terms, then you're much more open to hear the Jewish position. And I think this is a worthwhile strategy. I use it often in my shiur, because I happen to be trained in philosophy, to show that in non-Jewish terms, the idea has a certain purchase. It has a certain logic. It has a certain intuition. That opens up a person who's trained in thinking in non-Jewish ways, it opens him up to be able to think about the Jewish idea with much less prejudice. So I gave pride of place tonight to philosophy for that reason. Not because philosophy is more important than the Jewish idea, but the Jewish idea won't be heard and won't be treated with the open-mindedness and objectivity that it deserves without that philosophical prophylactic that's applied at the beginning. That's my belief. Okay.